The storm had not yet come, but the air already carried its weight. Texas sky, mid-August. Thunder slept behind the clouds, not ready to speak, but already feared. The wind moved low to the ground, dragging dust like regret, slow and inevitable. Nothing in that town moved faster than suspicion. Nothing in that town held its breath longer than shame. And yet, there she was, Ilara, elbows deep in a stranger's horse wound, water stained red, as if the land itself refused to forget. The earth beneath her knees was cracked, thirsty, angry. She scrubbed the blood in silence, her fingers chapped from old soap and older debts. The townsfolk watched from behind worn curtains and crooked blinds, half hidden but wholly present. They always watched her, never greeting, never helping. She did not look up. She never did. Eyes invite judgment, and Ilara had learned to survive without inviting anything. She smelled of sweat and iron and storm. Her hair was wild, not the kind you brush out, but the kind that carried stories. Wind-knotted, sun-blanched, heavy with memory. She wiped her brow with the back of her wrist, smearing more dirt across her temple, smudging the bruise that refused to fade. It had changed color with the days, first purple, then green, then the sick yellow of old hurt pretending to heal. A child laughed somewhere down the road. Then silence, like a string pulled tight. The saloon piano stuttered, then stopped, just like it always did when she passed. Laughter fell quiet, doors stayed shut. Ilara's presence was like rain on old firewood, unwanted, but deeply known. She did not dress like them, she did not pray like them, she did not ask for space, and yet her very breath felt like a trespass. A battered hat hung from a fence post just outside her shack. Its crown caved in, rim bent like a question no one wanted to answer. Folks said it once belonged to the last man who tried to make her a wife. No one touched it. Ilara didn't remove it. Some things stay as they are, not out of pride, but out of warning. That hat whispered more truth than gossip ever could. The sheriff hadn't arrived yet, but the wind had changed. It smelled of iron and rain, and something else, something human. The kind of silence that comes before a life is turned. The kind of stillness that breaks a pattern, not with noise, but with presence. And still, she kept scrubbing, her hands raw, her back stiff. The ache not just in her muscles, but in the space behind her ribs where belonging had once lived. She had not always been wild, but wild was the word the town used when they didn't know how to say woman who wouldn't bend, when they didn't know how to name grief that doesn't kneel, when a woman would rather bleed than beg. They called her too much. That morning the sky lowered its voice, the clouds gathered like a jury, and the town braced for something they could not name. It wasn't the rain that frightened them. It was the possibility that a story long buried might rise in the dust. It was the quiet rumor that sometimes storms bring not destruction, but change. And still, Ilara scrubbed. Her hands moved, but her mind wandered, drifting through names no one spoke anymore. A breath caught in her throat, heavy and familiar. She blinked once, twice, looked down at the water now murky with old pain. Behind her, the wind lifted the edge of her shawl. In front of her, the horse stilled, wounded but trusting. The storm had not yet come, but something had already begun to shift. Something ancient, something true, something that would not be silenced this time. He came in with the wind. No announcement, no badge flashed, no boots slammed against the floor like men used to do to prove they belonged. The saloon was half full, thick with the smell of ale and dust, cards shuffling in the corner, a piano hesitant to play. But when he stepped through the door, even the smoke slowed. The silent sheriff. People called him that not because he couldn't speak, but because he chose not to. And in a town where words were often knives, that choice felt louder than gunfire. He didn't sit near the fire or at the bar. He took the far end back corner, where the light was weakest and the exits were near. 1 cup of coffee, black, no sugar. He drank it slowly, as if time owed him something. No one spoke to him, and he seemed to prefer it that way. The next morning, before the sun had burned the dew off the porch steps, Ilara found a cup resting on her railing. Still warm, still full, no knock, no voice, no demand, just a presence that had passed through and left something behind. She stared at it a long while, half expecting a trick, half hoping it was real. Later that day, when no one was watching, she poured half the coffee into a chipped clay bowl and set it down for the dog that limped between the shacks. The dog sniffed, then drank. Her fingers trembled the whole time, not because of fear, but because kindness, when it comes from silence, is harder to accept, harder to return. She didn't sip the rest. She held the cup like something sacred, then poured the remaining warmth over the earth near her steps. The gesture was hers, alone. A thank you without voice, a burial for the ache of being seen. That cup kept showing up, Some mornings it was still hot. Other times, only the steam remained. He never left a note. He never waited nearby. The coffee came with no strings, and that was the strangest part of all. In a place where everything had a price, her silence, her labor, her bruises, this didn't. She didn't trust it. Not at first. But she didn't throw it away either. She never said, "Thank you." Not because she lacked gratitude, but because dignity was the only thing she still owned. Saying thank you would make it feel like a transaction. And this was not a trade. This was something quieter, something older than words. He never expected it. That was the other thing. No sideways glance when they passed in the street. No nods, no questions. Just space held, a rhythm honored. A kind of knowing that didn't need confirmation. In time, the cup became more than a gesture. It became a tether. Not a leash, but a thread. Thin, fragile, but real. Between two people who knew what it meant to live on the edge of conversation. Who knew that sometimes the loudest thing in the world is the space someone leaves for you to breathe. Her boots were old and cracked, but the lining hid something soft. Creased paper, tucked deep beneath leather and silence. A photograph, folded 4 times, its edges worn down like river stones, black and white, but time had yellowed it. One face blurred from handling. The other, a man with a sharp jaw and a scar that cut through his right eyebrow like a question never answered. No one had seen it in years, not even herself. But some nights, when the wind sounded like footsteps, she would unfold it in the dark, not to remember, to remind herself what not to forget. It was one of those mornings when the sheriff knocked, not with his hand, but with his shadow. He didn't step onto the porch. He only lingered as she stepped outside, still holding the boot in her hand, the paper visible for just a breath. His eyes caught it, just for a second, long enough, scar across the eyebrow. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. Recognition is a quiet thing when carried by those who don't speak to fill space. He looked at her, and for the first time she looked back, not through him, but into him. A flicker passed between them, not fear, not confession, something else. Guilt, maybe, or memory. She tucked the photo away and said nothing. He nodded once and turned back toward the trail. Dust kicked from his boots. It was the only answer required. There are truths that wear masks of distance. Her silence wasn't absence. It was armor. You don't bleed your story into the hands of a town that sharpens rumors like blades. You don't give your past to a place that already decided what to name you. The man in the photo was not her father, not her husband, but he had broken her all the same. And the scar on his face was proof that wounds carried stories, even when mouths refused to tell them. The sheriff didn't ask again, but the river told him anyway. There was a bend just outside town where the water ran slower, deeper. It's where the townsfolk used to gather. Before the scandal, before the girl with the wild eyes showed up covered in bruises and ash, they said it was a runaway story. They said it was a fire, but the river had seen what no one dared say. It had seen the man she left behind, the man with the scar. The man who still had friends in uniforms and power in places where silence was enforced, not honored. The river doesn't carry words, it carries weight. And in its slow winding, it reshapes the banks, alters the land, like shame, like grief, like a photograph folded over itself until the face you can't forget fades first. She drank from that river, washed with it, prayed near it when she still believed someone might hear. The town thought the water healed, but for her it remembered. Some stories don't need to be told. They just need to be understood by someone who doesn't flinch, by someone who carries silence not as avoidance, but as protection. And when she caught the sheriff watching the current days later, boots at the edge, eyes on the water, she knew. He had stopped looking for her secrets and had started walking beside them. The knock came at noon, when the heat was high and most folks stayed indoors. But Ilara was always outside, tending what little grew near the porch. Parsley, wild onions, a stubborn tomato vine that refused to fruit. The woman on the path wore beige gloves and carried a loaf of bread wrapped in clean cloth. Her smile was measured, her posture graceful in the way that suggested a life lived in pews and behind lace curtains. The preacher's wife. "Thought you might like something warm," she said, voice soft but trained. Ilara didn't answer, just wiped her hands on her skirt and stepped aside. The invitation wasn't spoken, but it was clear. Inside, the air was thick with dust and time. The woman placed the bread on the table and sat without waiting to be offered. Her eyes swept the room, polite and assessing. "It's hard sometimes," she began, "to be misunderstood." Ilara nodded once, a soundless agreement, but her back stayed straight, her shoulders unreadable. The preacher's wife didn't look cruel, and maybe she wasn't. But her kindness came with edges, her charity braided with warning. "People talk," she continued, slicing a piece of bread with delicate hands. "They always do. Sometimes it helps to meet them halfway. Sometimes silence sounds like defiance. There it was. Ilara stared at the bread but didn't touch it. She wasn't hungry. Not for food, not for advice, not for belonging carved with conditions. The woman sipped water from a tin cup, then leaned in slightly. I remember being new once. The eyes, the whispers, but I learned how to ease them. It's not always about being right. It's about being palatable. The word hung in the air like a sour note. Palatable. There was a long pause. Not awkward, just deep. Then, unexpectedly, the preacher's wife's voice dropped to something close to confession. They say you're wild, that you brought the storm, that men lose their names when they look at you too long. Ilara's gaze didn't shift. I don't believe all of it, the woman added, but belief isn't always required. Fear spreads without facts. Another pause, then quieter. You remind me of someone I used to be. The sentence didn't ask for response. It simply sat there, aching. For a moment, Ilara saw something behind the woman's eyes, tiredness hidden behind good posture, sorrow stitched into polite sentences. Two women, different shapes of silence, same hunger for something softer than survival. When the preacher's wife stood to leave, she didn't take the bread with her. She left it there on the table, warm and untouched. Sometimes people don't want you to belong, she said, adjusting her gloves. They want to own you. There's a difference. At the door, she paused once more. If you ever need anything, well, I doubt you will. But I said it anyway. She walked back into the light, her steps careful on the dry path. Ilara stood still for a long while after, the bread cooling beside her, the words still warm, the warning still sharp. Belonging, she thought, is never given, only bartered, and the cost is often your voice. She let the bread sit, not out of pride, but because hunger was one thing, and silence, chosen silence, was another. It started with a breath too still. Midnight had come and gone, but the wind hadn't moved. The sky held its silence like a warning. Then, without ceremony, lightning cracked the dark, white, wild, merciless. It struck somewhere behind the hill near her shack, and the dry grass responded the way dry hearts often do. It caught fire, fast and without apology. Flames whispered first, then roared. In a place like that, where roofs are patched with tin and fences are dry as bone, it didn't take long. She woke not to smoke, but to instinct, the kind that lives in the spine. She didn't scream. She didn't gather belongings. She ran, not away, but toward the backfield, toward the small lean-to where the mare slept, half blind, half lame, but still breathing. Ilara's bare feet hit ground, slick with ash and mud. Her skirt caught fire once, just briefly, a kiss of flame near the hem. She didn't stop. She cut the rope with her knife, slapped the mare's side, and watched her limp into the dark, safe. By the time the townspeople stirred, drawn by the smell of smoke and the glow on the horizon, the worst had passed. The flames had eaten half her roof, scorched the ground where she kept her memories in a locked chest, the photograph in the boot, the stitched handkerchief, the tin cup from the sheriff's first coffee, all gone. They didn't ask if she was hurt. They didn't ask what she'd lost. They asked how it started. Somebody said she was always strange. Maybe she called the fire. Somebody else said, witchcraft smells like this. And the whispers began to spread, even as smoke still curled from the ashes. The sheriff came just after dawn. He rode in slow, his horse kicking up blackened dust. He dismounted without words, walked past the crowd, past the accusations floating in the air like ash, and stopped in front of her. She was sitting in the dirt, her palms raw, her feet blistered, her eyes unreadable. He looked at her, then looked at the house, what was left of it. Then, without speaking, he pulled his coat from his shoulders and draped it over hers, not gently, not dramatically, just solid, steady. Someone from the crowd called out, "You think that saves her?" He didn't answer. His silence that day was not retreat. It was a boundary. Later, when the townsfolk had gone back to their windows and their stories, he helped her collect what hadn't burned: a horseshoe, a cracked mug, the metal hinge from her trunk. Not much, but it was hers. And when she saw him lift a scorched tin cup from the dirt, recognizable only by the dent near the rim, she looked away, fast, as if caught weeping, though no tears had fallen. That night, the town was quiet again, but different. The kind of quiet that follows a question not yet answered. The kind that waits, and somewhere inside that quiet, a new fire had started. Not the kind that consumes, the kind that clears space, that strips what's dead, that forces new growth, even in a place like that. Even in a woman like her. The smoke had stopped rising, but the air still carried its ghost. Ash clung to her skin like old shame, and her boots, once brown, were blackened, stiff with soot. She stood alone at the edge of what used to be home, the doorless frame staring into the nothing that remained. The sun hadn't yet cleared the horizon. Light came slow, reluctant, just like choice. The townspeople had retreated back into themselves. They always did. No one came to help. No one came to stay. She hadn't asked them to, but that doesn't mean she hadn't hoped. Not for rescue, but for decency. Her path out of town was clear. The road stretched east, empty. No fences, no watchers, just dry earth and the sound of wind rubbing against mesquite. She could walk, start over, again. She had done it before. She could do it again. But her feet wouldn't move. He was already there. The sheriff stood at the crossroads, just where the road met the trail. Not in the way, not in invitation, just there. His horse beside him, his coat still marked by ash from the night before. He said nothing, offered no direction, no opinion, only presence. She looked at him, then past him. The horizon didn't promise anything. Neither did he. That was what made it honest. Between them, silence. Not the cold kind. The kind that listens, that holds. There was no decision to be made. Not really. Only an acceptance of what had already been chosen. In the fire. In the coffee. In the coat draped over her shoulders like a truth unspoken. She took a step. Not toward the sheriff, not toward the road. Just forward. And he did not smile. Did not nod. But his eyes softened. The invisible debt. That was the name of what passed between them. Not burden, not favor, but the kind of loyalty born when someone sees your ruin and doesn't flinch. When someone stays through smoke and whispers, not to fix, but to witness. What remains unsaid is often what shapes us most. And in that moment, between ash and wind, between ruin and road, they said everything they needed to. He turned slightly, just enough to let his shadow fall across her feet. A gesture so small it could have gone unnoticed, but she noticed. And when she stepped into that shadow, she didn't ask for shelter. She simply allowed it. Behind them, the town watched. Through windows, from behind curtains, looking for a mistake. But all they saw was dust, two figures, one road, and silence. The kind that doesn't explain. The kind that doesn't apologize. The kind that stays. It appeared like most truths do, quietly, without permission. Folded once, set on the porch rail just before the dawn mist lifted. No weight to hold it down, but meaning. A handkerchief, faded blue, edged with wildflowers stitched in thread the color of rain. No note, no initials, no signature, just care, just knowing. She found it as she stepped outside, breath visible in the morning air, fingers stiff from sleep and soot. For a long moment, she didn't touch it, only looked, as if afraid that contact might break its spell or reveal its source. But there was no need. She already knew. Objects speak when people can't. A blanket placed on a doorstep, a cup of black coffee left in silence, a handkerchief, carefully made, left in full view with no demand, no debt. It said things words could ruin. The wildflowers weren't random. She recognized them. Prairie crocus, Indian blanket, a single stalk of goldenrod near the edge, not from the fields around this town, but from a place far west, where she was born, where the dirt was red and the sky opened wider than sorrow. A field behind her grandmother's cabin had been full of them. She hadn't seen those flowers in years, hadn't spoken that memory aloud to anyone, but someone had remembered for her. Her fingers brushed the fabric, light, threaded with intention. It wasn't the gift that shook her, it was the knowledge inside it, the precise tenderness of being seen without being exposed. Later that day, the sheriff passed by, on foot, no horse, no badge pinned, just a man walking beside his own stillness. He didn't stop, didn't look up at the porch, but his pace slowed, just enough to say, "I was here." That evening, as the first thunder rolled in the distance, she stepped outside. The handkerchief was folded in her pocket, but her hands were empty. The sky had turned the color of steel, and the air carried the scent of wet dust. Storm coming, again. He stood at the edge of her path, not close, not far, coat unbuttoned, hat in hand. He looked like someone who had nothing left to prove. She didn't invite him in. He didn't ask, but he stayed. Rain began to fall, slow and fat, soaking the wood, the earth, the silence between them. She didn't run, didn't cover her face. Just let it touch her, soft, clean, real. They stood like that until the light shifted, until the wind grew gentle, not speaking, not needing to. Some confessions come not with tears, but with presence. Some truths aren't spoken, they're shared, carried. And when she finally turned to go back inside, the handkerchief pressed warm against her chest. She paused just once at the door, looked back. He hadn't moved, but he was closer. It came without thunder, no warning, no spectacle. Just rain, real rain, falling steady from a sky finally willing to let go. After months of dust and silence, after fires and judgment, and eyes that never softened, the clouds opened, and the town forgot to breathe. Elara stood in the middle of the street when it began, bare feet against cool mud, arms slack by her sides. Her dress clung to her in places she didn't mind. The rain didn't sting, it soothed. It didn't cleanse, not entirely, but it touched what had not been touched in too long. The sheriff stood a few steps away, coat darkened with water, hat low, eyes not hidden. He said nothing, as always, but he didn't look away. His presence didn't fill the silence. It made room for it. People watched from their porches, hands curled around warm cups, eyes narrowing through the downpour. Some saw a woman who didn't flinch, others saw a man who didn't move. The rest saw only what they feared, that the world might not stay small if the wild were allowed to remain. Elara tilted her face to the sky and let the drops find her skin, trace the lines time and sorrow had carved. She didn't wipe them away. She let them mix with old sweat and older grief. This wasn't forgiveness. The rain didn't erase, but it changed the shape of things, made the ground softer, the air gentler. Children had stopped playing in the streets months ago. Too much heat, too much talk. But that day, as the water pooled in the wagon ruts, one small voice laughed, then another. Tiny feet splashing. A girl in a torn blue dress ran past Elara, bare feet spraying mud. No one pulled her back. No one scolded her. The sheriff's gaze followed the child, then returned to Elara. He didn't smile, but something in his chest eased. You could feel it in the way his shoulders dropped, not in defeat but in peace. She turned slightly, not toward him, not away, just enough to acknowledge that he was part of the stillness, that he had been there when the sky changed. The rain kept falling. So did old ideas, quietly, in drops, in glances, in the soft beat of water against wood and tin and skin. She didn't run, she didn't hide, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the town didn't turn its back. It simply watched and let her be. It wasn't much. 4 walls, a roof that still leaked near the back window, a porch with uneven steps and a rocking chair that no longer rocked, but it was hers, and for the first time, it felt like it was allowed to be. 2 cups sat on the railing every morning now, not always full, not always warm, but side by side, one dark and bitter, the other sweetened with a little milk when she had it. The routine was quiet, steady. Nobody called it love. That wasn't the point. It was presence. It was return. It was a rhythm not broken by fear. The sheriff no longer wore his badge. It rested on the kitchen table, dull with time, beside a coil of twine and a single rusted key. He hadn't resigned. He had simply chosen a different kind of authority, the kind that doesn't come with rules or force, just presence, just witness. Children had returned to the street. Not all, not loud, but enough. Their laughter was tentative, like birds testing wind. It was the sound of something returning that had never quite belonged but had always been needed. Her battered hat still hung on the fence post, exactly where the fire had spared it. The wind moved it sometimes, made the brim flap like a flag not claimed by any side. Some said it should be thrown out. She didn't. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a marker, a story still standing. They didn't speak much, she and the sheriff, but when they did it was never small. They spoke with glances, with pauses, with the way they stayed when others might walk away. Silence had changed between them. It no longer pressed, it no longer punished. It had softened into something else, companionship that asked nothing but truth. Some days she walked down to the river, alone, sometimes with him. The water still carried silt and secrets, but the bank had shifted, a little wider now, a little gentler. She stood at its edge and remembered who she was before they told her she was too much, too wild, too broken to belong. And she didn't cry. She simply let the memory breathe. The town kept on, as it always did. Some stares softened, some stayed sharp, but it no longer mattered in the way it once had, because she hadn't changed to be accepted. She had stayed still long enough for them to see differently. There was no ending, just another morning, just 2 cups, just silence that didn't ache anymore. Some storms are meant to wash away the old dust, others to teach roots where to grow, and as for whether she had been tamed, or if the town had simply learned to respect what it could never hold, that question remained. It didn't need an answer, it only needed time, and maybe for once time had chosen to stay.